I kept this part of my life hidden because the decision I made in the end still hurts me to this day. My name is Caleb, subscribe to this YouTube channel, and I'll begin my story. One day I suddenly realized my fork had stopped halfway to my mouth. For a second, I wondered if I'd actually heard correctly. Harper, my wife, had just casually announced she was going out to dinner with a coworker, speaking with a calmness as if she were mentioning something routine, like an email she'd gotten at work, or how unpredictable the weather had been lately. Slowly, I lifted my gaze, watching her carefully. Harper sat there, perfectly relaxed, slicing her steak into neat little bites, acting like everything was totally normal. But I knew her better than that. I knew exactly when she was keeping something from me, and more importantly, when she was setting me up for one of her little tests. So I waited. I thought maybe she'd crack a smile, let me in on a joke, or at least brace herself for my reaction, but none of that happened. She just kept eating quietly, as if she wasn't fully aware that I was studying her like a detective trying to solve a puzzle. The air in the dining room suddenly felt thicker. I carefully placed my fork down, rested my elbows on the table, and began examining every subtle shift in her expression. I noticed something right away. She wasn't looking me in the eye. That wasn't like her at all. Harper was usually the type who held your gaze, especially when she was trying to make a point. But tonight, her eyes kept darting away, too focused on each small movement she made. A coworker, I repeated, keeping my voice calm, controlled. Yes, she replied effortlessly, lifting her wine glass, appearing completely relaxed. Just a casual dinner. It was that ease, that total lack of hesitation, that got under my skin the most. Her response flowed smoothly, like she'd rehearsed this very conversation in her head already. I clasped my hands together on the table, fingers interlaced tightly. I wasn't naive. I knew marriages had their ups and downs, that occasionally people got restless, wanting something fresh or different. But this wasn't about restlessness or boredom. No, this was something else entirely. It was a test, one she'd handed to me openly, unprompted, practically daring me to react. I needed to figure out the rules she was playing by before I made any moves myself. So, this doesn't change things between us? I asked, maintaining a careful, steady voice. She finally lifted her gaze, meeting mine directly. The smile she gave me sent an uncomfortable twist through my gut. Of course not, she said softly, sounding almost sweet. You know I love you. Something about those words hit me strangely. For a split second, I felt an impulse to laugh, but instead, I just leaned back in my chair, swallowing down the tight lump forming in my throat. I knew there were plenty of ways I could respond, get angry, demand explanations, or escalate the whole thing into a full-blown confrontation. But that's exactly what she expected me to do. So I chose something else entirely. I gave her a casual smile, the kind you'd use when someone tells you a mildly funny joke. With complete ease, I replied, maybe I should go out with someone too. The silence that followed was a turning point. Harper blinked sharply, like she'd been slapped by an invisible hand. Her relaxed posture stiffened, shoulders tense now, and I noticed her grip on the fork tighten slightly. She hadn't anticipated that. This was her game, her rules, and I'd just flipped the board upside down. Oh, really? She asked, her voice lower now, confidence slipping for the first time that evening. I kept my cool, swirling the wine in my glass thoughtfully. Yeah, I said calmly. Maybe it'd be good for me too. There's a woman at the gym, Lena. I'm pretty sure she'd be up for it. That's when it hit her. I saw the subtle but unmistakable change in her expression. The color drained from her face for just an instant, and her lips tightened involuntarily. It was all the proof I needed. If Harper truly thought this little dinner meant nothing, if she genuinely believed our marriage could handle it, then why did the mere mention of another woman affect her so much? Because what she really wanted was control, total dominance over this scenario. But I'd just proven she didn't hold all the cards anymore. Without another word, I went back to eating, acting as though nothing extraordinary had happened. But inside, I knew exactly what had just changed. The rules had shifted, permanently. After that night, silence became a frequent visitor in our home. It wasn't the comfortable kind of quiet we'd once shared. Instead, this silence was heavy, sharp, and filled with unsaid words and unresolved tensions. Harper tried to behave normally, but she knew something fundamental had shifted between us. I hadn't argued or demanded explanations. I hadn't given her the dramatic confrontation she'd expected. Instead, I'd met her challenge with such casual ease that she was completely unsettled, and now there I was, sitting on the couch, perfectly relaxed, fiddling casually with my phone and wearing a faint, amused smile. It drove her crazy. I could sense her watching me from the corner of her eye, pretending to read a book she wasn't actually absorbing. Ever since that dinner, I felt different. I might have looked the same, followed the same routines, left for work at the usual time each morning, and came home precisely when I always did. But there was a newfound lightness in my movements, as though some heavy burden had been lifted off me. And Harper noticed. The intensity she once saw in my gaze was no longer there. That, more than anything else, disturbed her. Soon, she began picking up on the small changes. I was paying more attention to my appearance, not enough to stand out to strangers, but enough for someone as observant as her to notice immediately. I spent an extra minute or two deciding on a shirt, fixed my hair a little more carefully before stepping out the door, and overall, seemed to carry myself differently, more distant, perhaps, and then there was my phone, which I used to casually leave lying around the house. Now it was always close, always within reach. And truth be told, the buzzing got under her skin more than she'd admit. Harper didn't like it, not even a little. She tried hard to shrug it off, kept convincing herself it wasn't a big deal. I mean, wasn't this whole situation her doing from the get-go? She'd been the one to push the door open, but now, standing on the brink of something she hadn't quite anticipated, things weren't as straightforward as she'd imagined. It was as if she'd struck a match without bothering to check if the wind was blowing. Saturday evening was inching closer, and with every ticking hour, Harper felt her chest squeeze tighter. She couldn't even pinpoint exactly why.at the start of the week. She'd felt confident, grounded and sure of herself. She had things in check, felt like she was calling the shots. But by Thursday, that sense of assurance was rapidly slipping away, just like water slipping through her fingertips. Then, as we stood in the kitchen fixing dinner that night, I suddenly broke the silence, and it hit harder than it should have. "I'm heading out tomorrow," I announced casually. Harper had been chopping vegetables on the cutting board, her hand hesitating briefly at my words, but then she quickly went back to slicing, pretending nothing had changed. She didn't even glance up at me. "Oh, really?" she replied, trying hard to sound indifferent. "Yeah." That was it, no explanation, no extra details. Just one simple word, delivered calmly, as if it meant absolutely nothing. Harper waited quietly, partially expecting me to continue, to give her something else. But the only sounds filling the kitchen were the steady rhythm of her knife slicing vegetables and the faint sizzling of oil warming in the pan. Her chest tightened again. She didn't want to press. She didn't want me to know this bothered her, yet, despite herself, the question slipped out, "Got plans, or are you just heading somewhere random?" I reached over, picked up a dish towel, wiped my hands slowly, then leaned against the counter, turning my gaze toward her. I held her eyes a moment longer than usual before speaking with an eerie calm that sent a shiver running through her. "I'm going out with Lena." The knife froze mid-chop. The air evaporated instantly, leaving a strange emptiness between us. Harper blinked quickly a few times, trying to process the words I'd just casually thrown out. Her stomach twisted sharply. Her heartbeat kicked up faster than she'd ever admit. Still, she drew a deep breath, set the knife aside carefully, and faced me with that practiced, composed smile she'd mastered over the years. "That sounds nice. Hope you two have fun." I stared back at her like I expected more, a hint of jealousy, maybe some kind of emotional break. But when nothing else came, I simply nodded slightly, grabbed my plate, and headed off toward the dining room. Only after she was completely alone in the kitchen did Harper finally let her mask fall away. She leaned against the counter, suddenly weak in the knees, her fingers gripping the marble edge for support. She wished desperately she could just turn her feelings off, but the truth crashed down on her painfully clear and unforgiving. The idea of me with someone else sliced deeper than she'd imagined. The next day, she woke restless, unable to shake a lingering discomfort. Harper tried her best to distract herself with work, emails, phone calls, scheduling appointments, but her thoughts kept circling back relentlessly to that one question: was I genuinely going out with Lena? Part of her wanted desperately to believe this was just a tactic, my way of answering her challenge and calling her bluff. But deep down, that stubborn little voice inside her insisted otherwise, and it refused to let up. I wasn't the sort of guy who played mind games. If I'd told her straight up I was seeing Lena, I meant every word of it. As evening crept nearer, the heaviness in her chest intensified. For the first time in ages, Harper was experiencing a feeling she'd long since forgotten how to manage: insecurity. Late in the afternoon, she briefly considered sticking to her own plans. She had dinner set up with a coworker, a casual meetup. I'd even messaged earlier to confirm she was going. For a second, Harper contemplated going through with it, saying yes and actually stepping out the door, but the thought of spending time with someone else while I was out with Lena made her feel ill. She set her phone aside, walked quietly to her closet, and just stood there staring blankly at the neatly arranged dresses hanging in front of her. Picking one usually took seconds, but tonight, everything felt off. None of the dresses felt right. They all seemed like they belonged to someone else entirely, and then it hit her sharply, coldly, undeniably. She didn't really want to go out. What Harper really wanted was to be home when I got back. She needed to see my expression, hear the way I'd greet her. She had to know if tonight would change things between us, if this meant anything at all. Time moved forward relentlessly. 6:30 rolled around, and I hadn't breathed a single word about canceling my plans. She caught sight of me walking down the hallway, dressed up more than usual, a nice button-down shirt, hairstyle just a bit better. I grabbed my keys, checked my phone briefly. Without hesitation, she tried to sound casual, indifferent. "You heading out already?" I glanced back at her briefly. "Yeah." And just like that, I was out the door. No mention of when I'd return. Not a single detail. The lock clicked shut behind me, echoing louder than it ever had before, sending an icy chill racing down Harper's spine. Suddenly the apartment felt overly spacious, oppressively quiet. What had always felt like a comfortable silence now seemed unbearably heavy, suffocating. Harper picked up her phone, attempting to distract herself by scrolling mindlessly through social media. But her mind refused to settle on anything at all. Minutes dragged on painfully, 10, 15, 20, each slower than the last. Eventually she found herself staring at our chat history, her finger poised right over the message box. She wanted to message me, to ask directly where I was, who I was with, what exactly I was doing, but she forced herself to stop, knowing that reaching out first would mean admitting defeat. Instead, she locked the phone screen, tossed it onto the couch, and stood up. Moving toward the kitchen, she opened a bottle of wine, poured herself a glass, hoping the wine might ease the uncomfortable tension in her chest. But even after a few careful sips, the tightness lingered stubbornly. She wished for me to call, text, anything to reassure her I was thinking of her, at least a little. But the silence dragged on, minutes turning into endless hours, the only sound in the apartment the soft, unsteady rhythm of her own breathing. She honestly couldn't remember the last time she felt that alone. Then, just before 11, the door lock clicked. She froze right where she was, not moving a muscle. I came in slowly, setting my keys on the little table by the entrance. The light from the hallway hit half my face, and I looked composed. Too composed, not like someone who'd had a tough night. If anything, I looked relaxed, maybe even content. Harper rose from the couch, trying her best to sound unaffected. "Good night." I closed the door behind me and slid my hands into my pockets. Yeah. It was good. That's all I gave her. 3 words, nothing more. Her stomach clenched. She stood there, waiting, hoping I'd offer something, maybe a story, a detail, even a shrug. But I didn't say another word. I just walked past her, down the hallway, toward the bedroom. She remained planted in the middle of the living room, and out of nowhere, it hit her, this heavy, aching lump in her throat, like something had come loose inside her. For the first time, it really sank in. She wasn't the one holding the reins anymore. And worse than that, she might be watching me slip away, piece by piece. The next morning, before her alarm even had a chance to chirp, Harper's eyes were already wide open. The sun hadn't even broken through the blinds, and there she was, staring up at the ceiling, searching for answers that weren't there. That same pressure was still there, tight in her chest, making it hard to breathe, no matter how many deep, steadying breaths she took. Her thoughts kept looping back to the night before, the way I walked in like nothing unusual had happened. Calm. Completely unshaken. I hadn't asked why she didn't go out, hadn't cracked a joke, hadn't even glanced at her with curiosity. I gave short, surface-level answers and moved on like she barely registered. And that silence. It was unbearable. She rolled over, hoping maybe I was still lying there next to her. But the other half of the bed was empty. Cold. Her heart started to race. She threw back the covers and padded out of the room. There I was, standing in the kitchen. Already dressed. One hand holding a mug of coffee, the other scrolling through my phone. From the outside, it looked like any normal morning. But inside, everything felt wrong. "You're up early," she said, trying to sound easy and light. I glanced up at her, met her eyes briefly, and replied, "Got stuff to do today." That answer landed hard. Like a punch with no warning. Stuff to do. That wasn't how I talked. I was always clear, always gave context. Meetings, errands, grocery runs, whatever it was, I usually spelled it out. But now. just vague and distant. She sat down at the table, trying to hold her expression steady while everything inside her was twisted in knots. "Don't you think we should talk about last night?" I gave her a half-smile, flat, unreadable. "Do you?" She opened her mouth, ready to speak, but no words came. She didn't even know where to begin. A part of her wanted every detail, where we went, what we did, if anything happened. Was it just dinner? Or was it more? But asking those questions would be like waving a flag, saying she cared. And she wasn't ready to admit that. Not out loud. So instead, she looked away, reached toward the fruit bowl, and picked up an apple she didn't really want. Took a bite just to fill the silence. I finished my coffee, grabbed my keys and wallet, and headed for the door. "You heading out already?" she asked, checking the time. I stopped briefly in the hallway and looked over at her. "Yeah. It's still early." "I know." That was it. No explanation. No clue when I'd be back. I just threw on my coat, opened the door, and walked out. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound felt like a gunshot echoing through the apartment, and right then, Harper felt it, everything beginning to spiral. Like the floor was tilting beneath her, and she couldn't catch her balance. The days that followed looked normal enough from the outside. Same routines. Same coffee mugs. Same quiet mornings. But something vital had shifted. I wasn't the same anymore. I used to care, used to ask about her day, even when I was running on fumes. I used to make stupid little jokes just to see her laugh. But now, it felt like we were just sharing space. Like roommates on parallel tracks, never quite crossing. She tried to bridge the gap. Tried to spark small talk, tell me little stories, ask about my day. But my answers were clipped, bare, emotionless, like I wasn't even really there, and the thing that scared her the most wasn't the distance itself, it was how comfortable I seemed with it. I wasn't cold, not in a mean or bitter way. I wasn't picking fights, wasn't tossing sharp words or getting passive-aggressive. I just seemed, okay. Settled, and that calm. That scary, indifferent calm. It rattled her more than any screaming match ever could. For the first time in our whole marriage, Harper realized she had no pull anymore. I wasn't reaching for her attention. I wasn't trying to fix things or even pick a fight. I wasn't trying to do anything at all. I was just existing. Without her, and the more I pulled back, the more she felt herself slipping closer to the edge, like she was about to lose something she should have protected all along. That whole day, she couldn't sit still. Her nerves were wired, heart thudding harder with every passing hour. She kept checking the time, waiting for something, she didn't even know what. When the sun finally dipped below the buildings, the tension inside her snapped tight. She sat on the couch, legs crossed, fingers tapping restlessly on the armrest, trying to breathe through the anxiety clawing up her throat. Then, finally, she heard it. The key in the lock, her whole body tensed like a wire pulled tight. She sat up straight, ran a shaky hand through her hair, like that would somehow fix what she was feeling. I walked in like nothing was out of the ordinary. Took off my coat, dropped the keys on the console, and moved through the apartment with that same quiet calm that made her stomach twist into knots. She caught the faint scent of my cologne, and something about the way I moved, calm, easy, made her stomach turn. "You left kind of early today," she said, doing everything she could to keep her voice from shaking. "Yeah." That's all I gave her. She waited. Maybe hoping I'd ask about her day, maybe just looking for something to prove we were still connected somehow. But I didn't say anything else. Just took a sip of water, glanced at my phone, and let a small smile slip across my face at whatever I was reading, and that was it. That little smile, that was all it took. "Who were you with?" she blurted out, the words out of her mouth before she could stop them. I finally looked at her. And what rattled her wasn't anger or annoyance, it was the nothingness in my eyes. No heat, no kindness, no irritation. Just, calm. "Why does it matter?" Those 4 words hit her like a punch to the gut. Why did it matter? Because she could feel it, the unraveling. The shift. The silence she'd helped create when she thought she could play this game and stay in control. Because all the emotions she had hoped I'd feel when she mentioned having dinner with some coworker. She was feeling them now. Times 10. But she couldn't say that. Not without tearing down the little pride she had left. So she swallowed hard, kept her gaze on mine, and said, "Because we're married." She tried to say it with strength, but her voice cracked just enough to give her away. I set my phone down, crossed my arms over my chest, and met her eyes straight on. "Are we?" Her whole body went still. Those two words chilled her to the bone. What's that supposed to mean? I leaned in slightly, my palms resting on the edge of the table, voice steady and even. It means I've had a few days to think. And you were right. Dinner with someone else doesn't have to mean anything, right? So maybe this, us, maybe it doesn't mean as much as I thought either. Her stomach bottomed out. All the warmth drained from her. She didn't say anything at first. Just turned and walked to the counter, picked something up, and placed it in front of me. My eyes dropped down. A stack of papers. She stared at the top page, her breath catching. Right there in bold print, divorce agreement. She blinked, mouth dry. What? She whispered, voice barely hanging on. I didn't flinch. It's all signed. Just needs yours. Her hands gripped the papers like she could squeeze the moment out of existence. You're not serious, she choked out. I let out a soft, humorless laugh, dry, final. And you're not seriously surprised, I said, shaking my head. Silence settled over the room, cold and suffocating. She couldn't believe it. Couldn't believe this was the moment everything actually ended. She never thought it'd be me who walked away. I was the one who always stayed. Always showed up. Even when things were messy. I was the anchor. The quiet one who held it all together. Now, fear surged through her. She couldn't just let this happen. She had to fight back. Had to do something. She shoved the papers aside and straightened up, trying to sound calm even as everything inside her trembled. Okay. I forgive you. For Lena. We can move past this. Start over. I laughed again. Not softly. Not kindly. This one had an edge. It cut deep. You forgive me? I said, eyebrows raised. Like the words physically offended me. She nodded, even though I could see the panic building in her chest. Yes. And if you can just forget what I said about that dinner, we can put it behind us. Act like none of this ever happened. My eyes narrowed. I leaned in slightly, and my voice dropped, low, quiet, and final. I don't need your forgiveness. She froze. Those 6 words split something open in her that she didn't even know could break. Without saying another thing, I reached for my coat and grabbed a suitcase sitting by the door, one she hadn't even noticed until now. Already packed. Already zipped. That's when the panic really kicked in. She jumped up, heart pounding in her ears. Wait, where are you going? I opened the door, didn't look back, moving on. And with that, I stepped out into the night. The door clicked behind me, and the sound echoed like a closing chapter, final, heavy. Outside, the sky was already dark. Inside, the silence wrapped itself around her like a fog. Thick. Cold. She couldn't hear anything but her own heartbeat, loud and lonely in the quiet room. And right then, the truth hit her like a punch to the chest. It had never really been about losing me because she loved me so deeply. What terrified her, what truly tore her apart, was losing the control she thought she had. Losing the hold she believed she'd never let go of. But that didn't matter anymore, because I was already gone, and it was far, far too late.